As IUOCs or free will awareness units, does our reduction or increase of entropy occur as a natural consequence of the choices that we make? Or does it occur through the measurements, evaluations, judgments, and decisions that the LCS makes regarding our choices? So, thinking logically, entropy reduction or increase should take place as a natural consequence because that is how it was for the LCS when it started to evolve from a single bit of information to what it became today. But lately, I often hear you talk in terms of the system sort of looking at our lives and our choices and assigning points and keeping a score based on the choices that we make. For example, you say things like, the system takes into account how challenging the situation was for you, and if the situation was extremely challenging, then you won't de evolve as much for making imperfect choices. And that's really starting to sound like the system is somehow scoring us and deciding how much we should evolve or de evolve, rather than evolution occurring as a natural consequence. Or is it perhaps both? That, for example, in the same way that developers write AI code that evolves of its own accord, but sometimes the developers themselves step in and gives the digital creatures a boost or demerit depending on known factors outside of those creatures' self-evolutionary paths.
Probably the way I said that, the system takes into account how challenging the situation was. Um, I probably said that in a sense of everything being the system. The system's everything. We're part of that system. So in that sense, my sense of the system was including all the IUOCs and all of it together was as part of the system. So that was a very general system that I was talking about, not necessarily the LCS as opposed to individuated units of consciousness. What the point I was making was that in general, your entropy reduction or increasing is not just a trivial, it's not just a simple fact. Oh, he did a bad thing, entropy up. It also considers why you did the bad thing and the circumstances that surround that bad thing and what led you to that bad thing. And all of that's part of it. Just like a jury would take all of that into consideration if they were having to make judgment on somebody who had committed a crime. It's not just that you commit the crime, but it's the intent with which you commit the crime and what leads you to commit the crime, and it makes a difference on what the jury and how the judge provides sentencing. If you're just a diabolical criminal who just loves crime because you hate people or something, then they're going to judge you much more severely than if there was a lot of circumstances that led to you doing that out of desperation or something. It's like in Lemez, the boy steals some bread, but it's just because his family's starving. Of course, in that time, French didn't really care whether his family was starving or not. He stole the bread, and they didn't take any of those circumstances into effect. And of course, everybody who's read that play and that book says, "Oh, that's wrong." You have to have a bigger picture than just looking at the facts that a piece of bread was stolen. Makes a big difference how you deal with the problem. So I was just trying to get that idea across to people that, again, this isn't a machine. This is not a machine that has just been crafted to work in a particular way. This is an aware system. It's consciousness. It assesses, it judges, it evaluates. And I was speaking of all of it together as a whole, not just the larger conscious system versus the individuated units of consciousness, but rather as a whole. That's the way the system works. It's an intelligent system that is, um, it's designed to, as efficiently as possible, evolve positively. And by punishing people because they were pushed by circumstances to do something that was a bad choice, is not necessarily the most efficient way to, evolve that person's entropy. That's not a
Uh,
good
I'm s-
idea.
I'm still curious though. So let's say that in my lifetime I make a lot of very bad choices just out of a negative intent. Um and then as a result of that I de-evolve. Does that de-evolution occur just out, because I make those choices? Or is there a conscious entity that is evaluating all of this and deciding, okay, Erik had a really bad intent there, so he should de evolve? So is there like a conscious entity that's sort of a mediator between that in that process? Or is it just the choices themselves that evolve me or de evolve me?
There is a mediator of some sort involved in that. It's not, if it were just the processes themselves and nothing else, then that would be more like well, you stole the bread. Sorry, you go to jail, because stealing a piece of bread is against the law without thinking of, why did you steal the bread? So there needs to be an assessment, because otherwise you're judging people on action, on things they did, rather not so much on intent. Intent is the key thing. What was the intention? Well, for that guy that stole the bread, his intention was to keep his family alive. Well, it was a pretty good intent. That was his job. He was the father. He needs to provide for his family. So that was something he needed to do. So you look at the intent is really what's judged, not what you did so much. I guess that's the idea. It's the intention behind it. So that does require an assessment. It's not just a machine that says, "Oh, stole a loaf of bread, jail." That's too much like a machine. That's not a consciousness that's aware and sees the whole thing.
Couldn't you have a
So,
machine that looks at the quality of the intent?
well, not in the way I define a machine. I define a machine as that all the parts just move the way they do because that's what they have to do. That's kind of how I define a machine. It's a deterministic thing. It just you turn this wheel and something happens inside, and all that happens because you turned that wheel, and it'll always happen exactly that same way if you turn that wheel the same way. That's a machine. There's no uh, intention within it. It just reacts. It's just reactive kind of a thing. So when I talk about a machine, that's what I mean, something that has no intention. And I would agree, yes, there's probably some system set up that does those assessments, but I wouldn't call that a machine. That actually can decide and make choices based on circumstances, not just based on whether the wheel was turned a little bit this way or that way. It's not a machine is thoughtless. Now, where does that take place? Well, remember, the larger consciousness system and the IUOCs are all part of the same thing. It's only I only create an IUOC as a separate thing because that allows us to talk about that function. So if we just say that that's just a part of the larger conscious system, that's just a function within consciousness, you see, then it's all kind of in a jumble. But now we pull that IUOC out and make that like a physically separate thing. And now we have a problem of dealing, well, what parts interact with it over here and what parts interact with it over there. And now we create a lot of interaction questions that don't really exist. It's all one thing. And we have to separate it out to speak about it. So I make a metaphor. IUOC is a metaphor for a function within consciousness. That function within consciousness also has free will. It can make choices on its own. That's the kind of subset it is. But it's all just a piece of this whole larger consciousness system. So I think we're kind of pushing the metaphors a little further than they we're meant to go, in the sense that it is all a system. It's all one thing. And to say, well, this part of the system just does this and this part, well, it's not like there's these piece parts, really. It's consciousness. We just have, all right, this part that I usually call, the larger conscious system, that's the operating system. That's the master that, makes the rule sets and initial conditions that creates the virtual reality. And it's kind of in charge because it has the bigger picture, because that's part of the original monolithic consciousness that has grown up. And then there's us. But that sense of separation of IUOCs from that is not actual. It's all part of the same thing. So yes, we are, the LCS is a part of us, and we're a part of it. And we have to be careful that these metaphors don't become things. If the metaphors become things, then they create other issues, like the one that you raised. So I think that's really the problem there, is that there has to be some part of it that is not, that does judges and assessments and decides, how to evaluate things. And yes, that may be set up to be somewhat automated. Some things are more automated than others, but there's also a need for it to be not a machine, not automated, but to work with judgment and assessment for each one. So imagine that there's some part of the LCS that's the kind of the advocate for each IUOC. If we want to kind of place the piece parts one place or another, so then we could think of something like that. The larger consciousness system itself is a metaphor just for consciousness. These are all metaphors. And we tend to, because we live in this virtual reality that seems physical, we tend to make everything separate. And then we look for lines, connecting these separate things. And, well, this is a separate thing, so now what's going to interfere or do that? But it's really not like that. These are metaphors of functions within consciousness to make it easier for us to talk about that function. So we talk about a function. And for instance, some people want to know, well, what does the IUOC do all day? It just can't sit there puzzling over its 10,000 lives with its free will awareness units that it's created. I mean, okay, it could do that a little bit, but is that all it does all day long? It's puzzle over its 10,000 lives? That seems a little odd. Well, that is a little odd. What does it do all day at the office? Well, that's one of those things, that's one of those questions that comes up because you've thought of it as a separate entity all by itself. It's not. It's just a function within consciousness. So that's kind of over specificity of the metaphor. The metaphor just kind of is there as okay, that performs this function. But then when you start to connect it with lines and give it specific interrelational, well, then how does it relate to the LCS, and what does the LCS do with it, and what does it do to the LCS? The metaphors don't run that deep. They're just kind of superficial metaphors. It says, here's a function that consciousness has to perform. And the system takes care of it. The system being everything. So I think that maybe is my thinking, and maybe that's a little sloppy, thinking. It's more general, but there's lots of places kind of between, between the metaphors, the LCS, the IUC, the free will awareness unit, and I capture the things that have to be done in order for the model to work in those metaphors, and I explain those. But I don't necessarily try to rationalize every interaction between those things that could possibly happen, because I figure that's just the system, and the system works however it does, but it has these functions that it does, and I give those names. So that's my sense of it. I don't try to look at all of its wires and nuts and bolts and piece parts to see just how it does all that. I think if I did, the problem would be I'd just be making stuff up. I'd be
Yes.
looking at it and saying, yeah, well, there's an issue. How does it do that? And then I'd make something up to explain it. But just making all these things up is kind of conjecture, because
Yes.
in a system like this, in a system that's aware, there's probably 100 ways to do anything. Anything, there's probably lots of different ways to do it. So if I come up with one, and that's my conjecture, that's a disservice to people, really, because that may not be true at all, may not be like that.
Right.
The how the system works and its internal connections, with
Yeah.
with the various piece parts that I describe, is something that I have no idea exactly how all that goes about. I just say, well, the system does this because I can see the system. And I've done enough exploration with the system that I know basically what the system does and how it performs. And I know there's us, IUOCs. I know there's it, the operating part, the management. And I know that there's free will awareness units. And I know they have to separate some from the IUOCs. I let that be a separate thing. So those are the things that I understand from my own experience with consciousness, that those functions take place. But internally, how are all the connections made and what's going on, I don't know. And if I use conjecture, it would be wrong. It probably one chance in 10 that it was right. Now, if there's another function there that needs to be explained, then I could make another piece part and say, oh yeah, here's another metaphor. There's this bus that runs between, the IUOC and the LCS where they cross communicate in this information system. They have their special piece parts and com cards, and they're all netted together. I could come up with that, but to me, that's unnecessary complication. It's like, okay, so what value does one get out of that? None, really. There's no value in that. It's at a level of piece parts inside the LCS that is irrelevant, really, as far as we're concerned. As far as what we do and what we need, that's not a relevant thing. But quick and curious minds like to like to question every detail, and that's good. But I end up quite often telling people, well, that's just something that kind of falls between the metaphors.
Right.
I don't really know, and I don't really have any sense that I need to know. It's not a place to go, really. It's just, it works. It's part of the system.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Uh, there's some of these things, I've seen them on the internet, and it's like, how reality works. Well, there's 275 levels, and here's what all these levels do, and on and on and on and on. And that's what you get into if you start making stuff up with conjecture to try to
Yeah.
explain every detail.
Yeah, but it's
It gets silly, and of course, none of it's true. It's just stuff that has been made up to answer questions that
yes.
people might have, and I try to I don't go there mostly. I just hit the big the big pieces, the functions that matter to us, and the rest of it is just the way the system works. And however it does that on its own, and I'm sure it does it in the most efficient way possible.